The next session in today's symposium is Healthcare Design. Papers in this session will explore the current and future design, implementation, and experience of architectural interventions to respond to COVID-19 and its impacts, with a specific focus on healthcare settings. These papers will not only consider the unique implications of COVID-19 within and for practices and settings of health, healthcare, and health promotion, but also will foreground the experience and impact of these design interventions on first-line responders and medical providers in healthcare settings, inpatients and their loved ones, and passers-by and community members. Together, these presentations suggest a range of strategies to prevent and mitigate the effects of infectious disease in healthcare settings in the future, and urge us to do so in a way that considers the needs and experiences of a range of users. The case studies presented in this panel explore innovations in different countries, including Belgium, Serbia, Israel, Sierra Leone, and the USA. The moderator for this session is Dr. Angeli Joseph. Dr. Joseph is Professor of Architecture and Director of the Center for Health Facilities Design and Testing at Clemson University. Dr. Joseph's research focuses on multidisciplinary systems approaches to improving patient safety and quality in high-stress healthcare settings through the development of tools and built environment solutions. She was recognized as Researcher of the Year in 2018 by the Healthcare Design magazine.
Thank you so much, Mohammed and Caitlin, for inviting me to be a moderator for this session. As you introduced me, my work is all in healthcare, and I'm really passionate about the work we do here, along with the clinicians who are at the front lines fighting this pandemic. There has been a lot happening in this field. And while we've been dealing with some of these issues of infection prevention for years, it has taken on a whole other challenge with COVID-19. And I'm excited to hear about all the presentations from these 5 different countries today. So without much ado, I'm going to start with introducing our speakers from KU Leuven, Margot Annemans, Plunje Jeleba, and Anne Helgen are with the Research and Design Group at KU Leuven in Belgium. This is a multidisciplinary research team that works at the interface of design research and social sciences and humanities. Anne is a professor of design studies at the Department of Architecture, while Margot and Plunje are both researchers working in this research cross-design group. And on to you then.
It's a great pleasure for me to take part in the symposium and with all of you explore what we can learn from the spatial strategies applied in hospitals to separate COVID from non-COVID patients for the future of architecture and urbanism. Besides in terms of medical care, Corona has brought also considerable challenges in terms of space. In hospitals, these ad hoc spatial interventions range from a complete rearrangement of the admission to the emergency department to expansion of intensive care units with temporary capacity. But also in public space, in supermarkets, etc., the pandemic has had an impact on space and more specifically on the spatial organizations of social interactions. The research presented today was conducted in 6 general hospitals in Flanders that were diverse in location. We had both urban and suburban hospitals, diverse in scale. Some hospitals were one central campus, others were dispersed multi-campus hospitals, and diverse in age. Some buildings were brand new, whereas other ones were over 20 years old and planning renovations. For each hospital, we interviewed someone involved in the infrastructural adaptations, and this could be either a director of care supporting services, technical or facility directors, or a director of quality and strategy. In the interviews, the focus lay on what was being done and how the information process was organized. And today I will focus on what was done. Based on the collected data, we identified 5 strategies applied to separate COVID from non-COVID patients. And these strategies are adaptation of the program, temporary and new infrastructure, putting in new walls, including doors, making use of signage like arrows, fences, and stickers, and implementing new regulations and instructions. Today, I will focus on only 3 of them, on the adaptations of the program, on the temporary new infrastructure, and on the signage. Hospitals adapted the program of their buildings at various levels. At the building level, hospitals made program switches between buildings. For example, they would only admit COVID patients on one campus and not on the other ones of a hospital group, or they would make program switches between parts, like making use of unused zones or zones under construction, or making use of the pre-narcosis and recovery to change them into ICU wards. On the level of the wards, wards that were meant for COVID patients were closed off from the rest of the hospital with clear distinction between clean and dirty zones. And this required extra functions on the ward, such as additional storage, dressing rooms, and things like that. Sometimes even new functions emerged due to the COVID crisis. For example, a relax space specifically for COVID staff. Here we could ask ourselves the question, what will happen after the crisis? All hospitals involved made use of temporary infrastructure, such as tents and containers, and they were mainly used to accommodate COVID patients arriving at emergency department, where these people are examined, and this is being decided whether they should be admitted or not, and this is often done in collaboration with general practitioners. This additional infrastructure then allowed to increase capacity and at the same time also put stress, on the hospital environment. It took up parking space, it could block entrances, and it could hamper circulation. In order to keep distance, arrows, fences, and stickers were used to direct flows of people, mainly in communal areas, both inside and outside the hospital. In reality, mostly a combination of strategies is being used, as you can see in this picture. The garage for the ambulances is converted to a COVID triage zone, with separations being made using temporary tents. In order for people to use this new equipment as intended, extra signage is being put in place. And despite the efforts to maintain a strict division between COVID and non-COVID zones, the borders between both were crossed by people, material, and air. Staff enter and leave the hospital on a daily basis. Waste from COVID wards need to be processed elsewhere, and airflows are not necessarily stopped by spatial divisions. Spatially, the separation is mostly being challenged in the in-between zones, like interspaces and lift and air shafts. Especially in the in-between zones, combining strategies is key to guaranteeing a safe environment. At the same time, interventions in these zones bring existing rules such as fire regulations to heat, with, for example, fire evacuation routes that are being blocked by newly built walls, which may then cause a delay in evacuation when a fire happens. The COVID-related adaptations to the built environment affected almost everyone using the hospital and can be expected to have changed awareness of the surroundings. And this is not only the case in the hospital, but can also be expanded to other types of buildings like the supermarkets I mentioned earlier, to schools, or even squares and sidewalks. We saw that in many of these contexts, hygiene and infection risks are brought to the forefront as building qualities. We also identified that there was a rising need for additional spaces to guard people's mental well-being, like, for example, the relaxation zone for staff in the hospital. And we identified an increased spatial literacy amongst a wide group of people who became more aware of the physical environment and how that affects how they relate to others, think of measures in order to keep social distance. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the team from KU Leuven. I see so many similarities between what you're describing here and what we've experienced in the United States. And I love for our speakers from the 91 different countries to talk about which of these issues and strategies have translated to your countries. So feel free to add more to the chat so we can continue the conversation at the end. I wanted to introduce the next speaker. She's Shavrula Kautrempe from England, and she's going to be talking about hospital ward flexibility, equity, and virus exposure risk in Freetown, Sierra Leone. Sharula is an architect and epidemiologist currently completing a PhD in architecture at the University of Cambridge. Her work centers on cross-disciplinary applications of architectural history, building physics, behavioral sciences, and environmental health, aiming to deliver human-centric and performance-driven healthcare design.
In my presentation, I will explore how flexibility can strengthen the equity of exposure to SARS coronavirus-2 in naturally ventilated wards with limited resources. This presentation builds on the findings from my fieldwork at Connaught Hospital, which was a critical case study. The hospital is located on the west coastal zone of Africa in Sierra Leone's capital, Freetown. It is surrounded by a historical network of streets, mixed-use buildings, and informal settlements. Its historical buildings were built according to the basic principles of pavilion plan typology, while today it remains the main government-run tertiary hospital. Drawing on a mixed methods approach, the complex links between thermal conditions, thermal comfort, and adaptive behaviors with seasonal, temporal, spatial, and personal factors were defined, building on a multidisciplinary dataset collected in real time in occupied wards. When natural ventilation is the primary environmental mechanism for cooling and airborne infection control, hospital ward flexibility needs to be investigated from an interdisciplinary perspective that integrates the assessment of the architectural, environmental, and behavioral drivers of ventilation performance with expected clinical practices. In this way, differentiation in exposure and adaptive capacity among occupants can be identified and mitigated. Overall, all four case study multi-patient ward typologies had a beneficial design for the exploitation of natural ventilation. Ward 1 was a tropical nightingale ward, with a bedded areas allocation at the center and the auxiliary uses at the southeast and northwest wings. In the late 19th century, colonial architects and engineers, building on Florence Nightingale's experience in hospital design, developed and applied principles of environmental engineering for the maximization of potential for natural ventilation in colonial hospitals across the equatorial zone. Regarding the drivers of environmental performance in the case study wards, the windows lacked adequate shading devices and double-glazed windows, while internal curtains trapped solar radiation. At the same time, heat gains by conduction through the heavyweight external and internal walls and by convection through the uninsulated ceilings and floors reduced the potential of nocturnal cooling, contributed to higher nighttime overheating. Occupancy frequencies and diversity of activities remained high over the morning and evening shifts, creating continuous turbulences that contributed to uncertain distributions and dilutions of airborne pathogens, spreading high infection hotspots further away from patient beds. Although the Nightingale ward had the fastest cooling rate and the most extended periods of lower indoor nighttime temperatures, overall thermal conditions remained above acceptable thresholds. Measured air velocities indicated moderate indoor airflows, with slightly higher air velocities being performed close to a window area with open windows only in the Nightingale ward and Ward 4. Older nurses were more likely to be standing or sitting close to a window area with open windows. Observed occupant control window operation was unresponsive to indoor and outdoor environmental changes, and the group of nurses reported the highest percentages of window opening behaviors, whereas patients experienced the lowest air velocities and had the least control over their exposures. With the intention to minimize both exposure and infectiousness of the viral doses, the recommended interventions aimed at the maximum dilution and minimal dispersion of the pathogenic droplets and aerosols, as well as the reduction in the duration of the exposure of both patients and staff to highly infectious spaces. Modifications to the functional layout, the spatial partitioning, the flows of people, and infection control comprise the proposed design interventions. The recommended functional zones were limited to patient cubicles and nurse stations, the restrooms, and different storage spaces. Airborne transmission of the virus is considered likely, although it does not constitute the dominant transmission pathway. Higher ventilation rates will result in faster dilution and removal of viral droplets and aerosols. However, during periods when fresh air exchanges are low, all those droplets which are heavier than aerosols will land to different surfaces and will be removed through cleaning and disinfection. Smaller particles will flow around over more extended periods. These tiny particles are particularly sensitive to pressure differences and turbulences caused by occupants' movement and activities and can travel distances more than 2 meters. Therefore, freestanding floor-to-ceiling plastic partitions were proposed to form single occupancy patient cubicles in the open plan bedded areas. Continuous occupancy over shorter periods was allowed only to nurses, doctors, and cleaners with pre-assigned circulation zones. Additional infection control measures included the following recommendations. Every patient cubicle had its own window within less than 2 meters from the bed. Its bed head was placed opposite the window area. In this way, medical staff could perform their task with their backs turned opposite to the windward direction. Nurse stations were also close to the window areas. Opening and closing the cubicle doors could contribute to the dispersion and mixing of air pollutants along the corridors. Therefore, in these areas, the installation of upper room UVGI lamps could contribute to stagnant air filtration. Patients had to be stratified between more and less moderate cases with stronger or weaker immune systems and placed accordingly to cubicles with stronger or weaker airflows and securely sealed doors. Furthermore, different hand hygiene stations for different use between patients and staff were installed at critical locations. As the COVID-19 pandemic evolves, historical hospitals, which comprise a significant part of the most fragile healthcare infrastructures across the global south, accommodate the treatment of COVID-19 patients in naturally ventilated wards. Historical wards built according to climate design principles before air conditioning, such as the Nightingale typology, might be more suitable for the treatment of COVID-19 cases, even if their embodied capacity for high ventilation performance might have been partly impaired. The existence of openable windows in hospital wards does not imply an efficient ventilation performance. Occupants need to be trained to operate the windows in climate-responsive ways. In naturally ventilated spaces, although high indoor airflows can be achieved sporadically, the strength and the direction of airflows can be unstable and highly unpredictable. Therefore, the ward's adaptive capacity is a function of the flexibility of its layout, not only to accommodate different clinical practices, but also to maximize the protective impact of fresh air against airborne infection among all occupant types. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stavroula. That's such an important topic, and not just in healthcare, but almost every building type, we are now thinking about airflow and management of airflow. So that's very, very timely indeed. Our next speaker is Lucy Morheim. She's going to be talking about rethinking personal space needs in hospital settings in the post-COVID-19 era. She's an adjunct lecturer at Tel Aviv University in Israel, and also the director and founder of the course Space Planning, User-Centered Consultancy. She earned her PhD in architecture from the University of California, Berkeley, USA. Her publications focus on user-centered research in architecture and urbanism, post-occupancy evaluations, social and environmental sustainability, and spatial justice topics.
Hi. Analyzing how a building can be best adapted to its multiple users' needs based on evidence-based research is critical in complex buildings like hospitals. This analysis is conducted in an internal medicine ward of Beilinson Hospital in Israel as part of my postdoctoral research at the Technion, and it particularly demonstrates how the match between a ward layout and users' personal space needs influences the experience of the ward corridor for all users, and why psychological factors matter in order to efficiently operate a hospital. Internal medicine wards present a unique problem. Users with competing needs occupy the wards, such as medical team, patients, and visitors. Patients are there at their most vulnerable state without full control over their space, territoriality, and privacy needs. For instance, they don't have control over the layout, who enters and exits the rooms, and when. Personal space needs such as proxemics, territoriality, and privacy are fundamental concepts in environment and behavior studies, as they define our relationship with other people and how we non-verbally communicate with others through use and modification of physical space. The findings of this research show personal space needs play a direct role in density, sense of crowding, and movement of people in internal medicine wards, and in efficient operation of hospitals. These concepts also directly inform post-COVID planning, given the role that distance between people play on how rapidly the disease is spread. Therefore, understanding personal space needs, especially in a building type like healthcare settings where people may be more vulnerable to diseases and where medical teams' health is also at great stake, is extremely relevant and important. In order to understand what might be about the architectural design that causes corridors to feel overcrowded, I created behavioral maps. This was an important question because, as the medical team stated and as the literature illustrates, visitors are needed as caretakers, but visitors also frequently interrupt medical staff, invade privacy of patient information, and these interruptions may lead to medical errors. Once I created the maps, I tallied the findings and analyzed them, and this is how the behind-the-scenes work looked like. Here you see the floor plan of an internal medicine ward. Each dot represents people that waited more than 3 minutes in the same location. So blue dots are representing the visitors and green dots are representing the doctors. During morning patient checks, every time doctors enter to a room with multiple patients, because of patients' privacy, they need to ask all visitors to go out. What happens then is explained by psychological needs of territoriality and proxemics. Visitors don't want to go far away from their patients. More than half of the visitors were territorial about their waiting area. Also note that there's no nearby waiting areas for them to have visual and auditory access to their patients. So they get out of the room and they try to stay as close as to the room possible. For instance, those that leave this room prefer to wait in this area in the corridor. There's also commotion because if visitors' first territorial choice doesn't work, they go to the next corner, like here, this corner, and when the first choice becomes available, they go back there. So there's constant movement in the corridor, which adds to the feeling of overcrowdedness. Another analysis showed how users' experience and interaction with a certain layout depends on their privacy needs. In hospitals, people are crying, grieving, and talking on the phone. These are all activities that require different levels of privacy. Of all of the privacy-requiring activities, about 77% of them took place in semi-private areas, such as secondary halls, staircase halls, nooks, at far ends of the corridors away from nurse stations and main traffic, and even in vacant rooms like here. Which is to say, people need spaces where they could feel private, but such places didn't exist in this floor plan, so they had to use whatever was available. So these findings illustrate how a simple analysis can reveal something very basic about psychological and environmental needs that architecture should address, but many times such fundamental things can be overlooked if no proper analysis is conducted. To conclude, in terms of design, this analysis leads to reconsidering the design of waiting spaces. For instance, and I'll switch to a previous slide for a second, specific to the Belgrade Hospital, versatile use of this existing meeting room located at the end of the corridor, which is vacated by the medical staff exactly before the morning patient check starts, could be made available to visitors. Its location provides direct visual access to the corridor and to some extent meets the proxemic needs unique to the healthcare settings. Other design solutions for similar behavioral settings may range from creating multiple separate family rooms, for instance, ones that can accommodate large religious grieving families that may require higher levels of privacy, to decentralized small waiting areas for smaller groups, and perhaps creating multiple waiting niches in the corridors that provide quick visual and auditory access to patients. This research also demands revisiting the everlasting discussion about whether shared rooms or private rooms should be prioritized, and points to another consideration in this discussion, given that the number of patients in a room means how many visitors will occupy the corridors during patient checks and increase the sense of overcrowding. And finally, the broader implication of such research and in relation to the post-pandemic planning is to note that personal space concepts are still not fully examined in different contexts. In each building type and sociocultural context, these concepts manifest differently, evident in how this study provided a nuanced understanding of proxemics unique to the healthcare settings and visitor needs in a Middle Eastern culture, and also unique to the operation of this specific hospital and its layout. As sociocultural and spatial contexts change, which also applies to how COVID pandemic is reshaping the ways in which we engage with the space and people around us, these concepts will need to be revisited in order to better understand how design can most effectively meet user needs. So pandemic reminds how these fundamental concepts are extremely relevant today and deserve attention for creating more user-friendly architecture and for managing social distance through architectural design in an informed way. In case anyone is interested in more details, this research is published in Facilities Journal and is available online. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Lucy. That was such a fascinating study. And I think looking at behavior mapping methods is really helpful to understand how people actually live and work in spaces. Just interested to see how other countries are dealing with family visitation during COVID, because I know in the US, family members are often not allowed into units, into ICU units or med-surg units, just to reduce the crowding and to prevent any kind of transfer of infection in the units. So curious to know what other countries are doing in this particular arena. So our next speaker is Katerina Angelkovic from Serbia, and she's going to talk about epidemic metabolism in oncology hospital design practices during the post-COVID age. Katerina is a theorist, practicing architect, researcher, and a painter. She served as a visiting professor and chair of creative architecture at the University of Oklahoma, USA, and she's also taught at in Oslo at the University of Belgrade. She's a full author of the Preliminary Architectural Design, a national project supported by the government of Serbia, related to new building in National Cancer Research Center in Belgrade.
Hello, my name is Katerina Angelkovic, and today I will talk about epidemic metabolism in oncology hospital design practices during the post-COVID age. From the very outset in the 1940s, the Oncology Hospital in Belgrade was intended to be a teaching and research institute which deals with the basic cancer research, clinical research, but also with preventive and all diagnostic and therapeutic disciplines. Already in the 1940s, the institute had a laboratory for experiments, a histopathological laboratory, and the department for surgery. To date, the complexity of the function has been accompanied by the need to provide adequate planning for the treatment and care and to upgrade hospital capacities due to the increase in the number of cancer patients after the NATO bombing of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in 1999. As part of the initiative of the Ministry of Health Republic of Serbia in 2016, I took part of the team of experts who were assigned to develop a program for designing a new building in Oncology 2. This project is centered on the site of the old building, Institute for Oncology and Radiology, and is the next phase in the redevelopment of the complex of hospital buildings in the heart of Belgrade. The COVID-19 outbreak affected conditions, policies, protocols, and normatives for planning complex buildings, redirecting all multidimensionality of architecture into a time-space monochannel. The context of this research is the dynamic changes in operational and functional environment of the oncology hospital in the post-COVID age in regard to the measures taken to protect a highly risk group of oncological patients. The metabolism metaphor originates in a radical reimagining of the city form in the early 60s, in the Japanese metabolist idea of the city as an organism characterized by transformability, indeterminacy, instability, and unequal growth in its various parts. In this presentation, metabolism is used as a method for analyzing ways in which metabolic regulation maintains a constant set of conditions within the system and control the disease. Instead of maintaining the vital capacity of health, medical, and social systems, the epidemic metabolism has become a mechanism for progressively destabilizing them. Can we say that reimagining the architecture of hospital space and time as metabolically medicalized has now become imperative for such changing conditions, asking what is the role of architecture in these processes? I argue that current concerns with medical processes cannot be articulated in architecture simply by adopting new approaches to physical and organizational structures and technology analysis, but rather to the relationships of production of epidemic metabolism evidence. If metabolism is originally a biological concept used to describe processes and transformations involved in maintaining the vital state, metabolism then symbolizes the state of the epidemic curve, where the curve itself and any bounded mechanism can be measured by metabolic activity. Therefore, epidemic metabolism as a metaphor for hospital design can be used to measure the medicalized flows and to regulate sensitivity of its causal mechanisms in relation to the higher risk group of patients such as oncological. Taking the oncology hospital design practice in Belgrade as my case study, the production of epidemic metabolism evidence is measured in relation to the design of spaces that work to integrate different groups of users in the hospital in order to provide space-time mobilities of people, goods, instruments, and equipment. Epidemic metabolism in its unique sample should allow us to read the current condition in the parts of the building so that the condition is controlled in all enclosed spaces. In relation to the specifics of the oncological diseases, the following issues need to be addressed. Firstly, a special treatment process whose effectiveness depends on the planning of the therapy itself. Secondly, the therapies cannot be delayed. Third, the spread of coronavirus and increased number of medical examinations and operations in reduced space-time frames. Fourth, checkpoints are introduced, as you can see on the picture, to prevent sick patients from entering the building, measuring the body temperature at the entrance and conducting rapid diagnostic tests for COVID-19, as well as opening new entrances and exits. Fifth, hiring guides in the hospital building due to the ban on larger indoor gatherings. Sixth, urgent delivery of medical equipment and materials for protection with regulation of access roads. Seventh, efforts to create conditions in a hospital that would prevent infection of patients and consequently surgeons and other doctors. For example, regulation of the time regimes of movement of all kinds, distribution of goods, food, equipment by other means outside the building, and distribution within the building. To be able to control the pandemic through diverse regimes of circulation, inhabitation, and segregation, it is urgent to prepare realistic scenarios for the harmonization of future oncology hospital design principles in the framework of continuity and change. Firstly, new technological systems and communication structures must be provided. Separation of dirty and clean pathways, as well as the movement of people and goods. It is necessary to add new communications on the facade, delivery of goods, patients, and movements of medical and technical staff, as well as services for regular maintenance of medical linear accelerators and their daily control. Secondly, entrances are separated, measures are taken to avoid undesirable gatherings, and alternative spatio-temporal regimes are introduced. It is necessary to add external elevators within the planned double-skin facade, and also it is necessary to separate the clean and dirty pathways in all units and parts of the building. Third, the regulation of this flow involves reappropriating the facade through the use of light, video, and sound signals in the double skin in an alternating regime, where the mode white means modernist cleaning and returns the system to its initial state of free access for a minimal group of patients, while the intensity of signals increases with the feeling of building capacities. It is also planned to develop a new application on mobile devices. Then, planning air distribution in certain zones, it is necessary to reconstruct the ventilation ducts and throw them out on the skin facade, and providing a generator for automatic power supply for all systems in a case of high-risk situations, in which absence of people must be foreseen. So hospital design, in conclusion, should not be regarded as static assemblage of spaces, but rather a flexible and adaptable network of continuously reconfigurable structures and the supporting mobile infrastructure. In conclusion, Le Corbusier's 100-year-old lesson, which traces the historical curves from the Enlightenment across industrial age, indicates the constant effort of the architects to provide means to prevent disease. The COVID-19 panic is fundamental in the reconnection between body, politics, society, climate change, and other environmental effects. In Le Corbusier's terms, bad metabolism could equate disease with disorder in the city. If transposed to the scale of a single building, this effect could be measured with regards to new architectural orders implied by the transmission of coronavirus. This said, the position of the new oncology hospital should be determined in connection to the traffic corridors, natural environment, and remoteness from the city center. In a long-term perspective, it is necessary to design a whole logistics and medical guidelines, as well as facilities to support separation of infectious from healthy people, and along with special controls and regulations that would come to life in the long run through instructions. Just like tuberculosis and cancer completely reconceptualized the human body and announced a widespread call for organized sports in the early 20th century, as Beatrice Colomina reminds us, in the context of COVID-19, it is fundamental to advocate for discipline and solidarity, and to use contagious disease to express concern for social order and political theory. If we put these issues in the basis of political theory, we can imagine the space of a continuously changing environment that we can act upon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Katerina. It's very true that in many ways the hospital can be the center or the heart of places where it locates, not just by providing care to the sick, but also being the location for healthy communities and healthy well-being. So definitely worth discussing further. Last but not the least, I'd like to introduce my colleagues from the United States, Jeremy Cargan and Rolf Hartsted from CRGA Design. They will be presenting visualizing healthcare design's alternative futures through technical and typological innovation. Rolf is a senior vice president with CRGA Design, and Jeremy Cargan is a project architect. CRGA Design is a comprehensive architecture, interior design, and planning firm dedicated to healthcare facility design.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for your active interest in this topic. At the recent HCD conference, a national trade event for healthcare design professionals, the buzz was all about imminent changes to the design of healthcare facilities post-pandemic. A panel of experts shared the following observations. Hospitals will require increased modularity to accommodate surges in demand. Facilities will require more flexibility. In other words, individual spaces will have to serve multiple functions. New infection control practices will impact patients' experience of healthcare environments. Telehealth will become more commonplace, and so environments that facilitate telehealth must ensure more effective provider-patient communication. The mission of medical businesses will become more explicitly community-oriented, with a concurrent expansion of the definition of health-related services. Exterior spaces will become increasingly utilized as functional spaces for certain kinds of healthcare practices. All the panelists agreed that the current pandemic is an innovation accelerator, but what will that innovation actually look like? What you'll see following is Jeremy will present two possible futures. One, a speculative medical office building that is very different from most commercial projects of its ilk, at least here in the United States. And secondly, an investigation of what unique problems could architecture solve in our post-COVID future.
The basic premise derives from the sectional diagram. Testing and screening will become a permanent part of all such buildings. Their design will adapt to assure rapid throughput, not unlike airport security. These buildings should and will emphasize outreach, combining well-ventilated public spaces for health education with always needed services like pharmacy and equipment sales. The material palette here emphasizes wood to evoke both efficiency and warmth. Such spaces may have a scale that we have traditionally associated with civic buildings, what the museum was in the 1990s. This new hybrid medical facility may be for the foreseeable future. Now, medical office buildings should and will become destinations with diverse spaces encouraging social and physical activities. Now, a sculpture like this one doesn't guarantee good health outcomes for the kids foolish enough to climb it, but joking aside, roof gardens of this kind should become increasingly popular as neighborhood amenities. This is already true in many countries around the world in different kinds of buildings. Our medical office buildings should join them. Now, we'll still need conventional exam and treatment rooms, but with better vertical access than today. And like any urban building, the topmost floor should be open for public events. Would you book your wedding at the neighborhood MOB Sky Lounge? Well, like I would. Now, before moving on, one word about graphics. We've heard for 50 years about learning from Las Vegas, and it is true that healthcare spaces already make use of environmental graphics to set a mood or to foster serenity. But that's not enough. It's a fight out there, and the fight is a cultural battle for attention, for authority, for belief. This design includes billboard-sized supergraphics in a pragmatic nod to healthcare architecture's need to promote and to advocate and to attract. Advertising works for new iPhones, why not for our individual and our public health as well? Now, the second project came about in response to a colleague's questions. What unique problems must architecture solve in a post-COVID future? In considering a different Baltimore site, an answer might include the following. Architecture must help us manage better our surge capacity during times of crisis. Architecture must help us better manage the spatial interface between sick people and everyone else, between illness and health. And between crises, when the surge recedes, Architecture must provide urban amenities not available otherwise. Our cities need transient housing at all income levels. Perhaps a new kind of architecture can address that too. And well, what about fun? Can architecture post-COVID serve up exciting, attractive, urban places? Finally, to consider the message of this conference, what can we learn from architectural history about our post-COVID future? Or for that matter, literary history? As you can see here, Thomas Mann's famous book, The Magic Mountain, is set in a sanatorium setting high in the Swiss Alps. Maybe we need a 21st century urban-focused counterpart. Among healthcare precedents, actually, the 19th century sanatoria provide compelling examples of healthcare architecture with unique adaptations to provide light, air, and quasi-spiritual nourishment for their occupants. Modernist examples, including the brilliant Pamillo Sanatorium by Alvar Aalto, expanded the architectural vocabulary of the type, aligning its aspirational spirituality with austere abstraction. Other buildings from the 20th century asked related questions about exteriority, sometimes purely formal exercises like this crazy example, and sometimes more sophisticated experiments in spatial and programmatic interpenetration like this project by OMA. Examples from the history of art have explored these themes too, whether in illusion or in madness. Our point is this: the contemporary profession of healthcare architecture is usually, first of all, program driven. Well, what could be different if we speculate visually rather than functionally? So that's the background of this project, a future day sanatorium sited right in downtown Baltimore near the Inner Harbor. Whether housing a surge of patients during a pandemic or a flood of tourists during a national convention, this project makes its vertical circulation a public attraction. During times of epidemic, we can use electronic access to control carefully who goes where, defining the interface between the ill and the healthy, while both use the building at the same time. Unlike most urban buildings in North America, this design ignores the usual expectations of building bulk, blasting open views in all directions. And when the crisis is passed, the project's small apartments would be available for short-term rental or even longer-term housing for Baltimore's homeless. Best of all, its prime location at the city center would express our willingness to put health and housing at the center of our social contract. That's where it should be. Maybe in a post-COVID future, we can advocate for all these lessons here in the United States, if not elsewhere around the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rolf and Jeremy. I think you did a great job in summarizing all the different topics and themes that we're talking about and that we are hearing about, as well as setting us up for a discussion about the future and where we need to go. And I think that's the big issue for all the different panels in your own fields. It overlaps so much with, what happens in healthcare, overlaps with what's happening in the home, what's happening in the community. There's so many connections over there. But some of the key themes that I heard across from all these presentations and that have been the topic of concern for me individually as a researcher and a practitioner in healthcare design have been these issues of adaptability and flexibility. How do you respond to a crisis such as the one we're going through while you're in the midst of it? And what do you learn from it for the future? How do you design these facilities so that they can work for the now, but at the same time, in the future, if something comes up, we can flex and expand and adapt quickly to these things in a safe way rather than in the piecemeal way that we've had to at this point in time. So I think those are some of the issues that I'd love for the panelists to think about and be ready to discuss. The one issue that I haven't heard as much about is the concern with end-of-life care and isolation for people who are being taken care of in ICUs and med-surg units where they're separated from their families. They barely have any physical connection either with their caretakers or with their family members. And that is a big concern. Telemedicine is another big factor that's going to impact how we design our buildings in the future. It was always coming, but now with the COVID pandemic, it has become a huge thing, especially in the United States. More and more care than ever before is being provided via telemedicine. And many of the things that may have required a clinic visit could now possibly be done via telemedicine. There are some kinds of emergency care that can also be provided by telemedicine. What are the implications for design? The emergency department continues to be at the receiving end of a lot of the pressure that the system faces. And there are a lot of issues with separating sick patients from visitors and managing flow over there. And many of you talked about the workflow of patients and staff. So I think that's something to think about. Another issue is staff burnout. That is a huge problem. It always has been. And this has pushed it to the forefront, where our staff are working day and night to provide care for highly infectious patients, while at the same time being worried about their own health and the safety of their families. One other thing I'd like to bring out here is the new strategies that are being put in place kind of outside the hospital to provide COVID-19 testing, vaccination. What is the long-term sort of solutions for these facilities? Can they become an addition to our existing hospital campuses, where they can take care of things like vaccination on a regular basis without using the facility resources? And then, of course, the whole issue of airflow. I mean, that is huge. It always has been. But now, especially with ICU care being important and the need for negative pressure rooms, that becomes something to think about that we have to consider here. I've been doing a lot of work in operating rooms. And one of the big concerns has been that ORs are designed to be positive pressure, that the airflow is from the OR to surrounding spaces to protect the patients. But in the context of COVID, the strategy has been to make them all negative pressure, where the patient is potentially the source of infection, and the desire is to protect the clinicians as well as the surrounding spaces. But that has a lot of infrastructure implications as well. So, just with that, I want to actually move it to the conversation with our speakers who have done such an amazing job. And there's some great questions out there. If you would be willing to please have your screens up and as well as your unmuted, then we can have some of these questions for conversation. I'm just going to take a quick look at some of the questions that are here. So one of the questions is from Ram Maikala. He asks, how can elevators be part of future designs? Especially when you're talking about more vertical designs. If you have COVID-19, elevators are often a place where there's a lot of it's a block, and you're trying to distance people. How can the 6-foot distance accommodate people in elevators? So I think that's probably more for Jeremy and Rolf in terms of your future concept for the hospital, and as well as for anybody else.
There's no good answer without spending resources. And, in as much as our projects are social satire, the target of that satire is the need to bring new resources to the healthcare architectural problem. Specifically with regard to vertical circulation, well, the projects we're showing are showing escalators, exterior spaces, and more generally one-way traffic, so that you come in, you go out the different way. But none of those answers are realistic unless the institution is willing to manage the people in a way that serves the architecture and vice versa.
It's an interesting question. I think about negative pressure and different environments as we move forward. We did a hospital, this was actually, we were lucky, it was years ago, where we had a med-surg unit that we could convert to negative pressure, and it actually alleviated the surge, and this was in a rural community. With elevators, I don't know, it's possible to think about segregating elevators and having high-risk elevators. And you could probably, with the shaft construction, think about essentially different pressurization. You do it with exit stairs. So, I mean, it might be worth an investigation. It seems like one of the more simpler solutions here is airflow and natural air. And certainly there's a lot of precedent of exterior wall elevators, that have views, and maybe they have some ventilation as well.
Great, thank you. I wanted to ask Stavroula if she had any comments about airflow, and many of the case studies that you looked at were natural ventilation examples, and like the Florence Nightingale wards. Unfortunately, US hospitals are not designed for natural ventilation. Do you have any thoughts about what we can do in mechanically ventilated buildings that are primarily like that? how can some of your findings apply to other kinds of hospitals?
Yeah. It's much easier for a hospital ward which is mechanically ventilated to be upgraded to a negative pressure room or to a hospital, to a ward which is more effectively ventilated. Actually, when we're thinking about hospitals, we're thinking about a totally controlled environment in terms of different aspects, including ventilation. Well, that is not true for many poorer parts of the world. So in terms of United States hospitals, I was thinking that in rooms where we are uncertain about the effectiveness of dilution and discharge of the pollutants, it is very important to separate highly infectious patients and highly infectious procedures from the rest of the room, and try to expose these expected spaces which will have very dense and high viral loads to the most well ventilated corners of the room or small spaces in the room. So it's about separation, minimization of dispersion, and minimization of the viral dose and the expected exposure.
Thank you. Would any of the other panelists like to add anything around airflow and contamination from your countries and your experiences? Katrina?
I would like to add something about circulation communication, because I find it very, very difficult in the present moment in Belgrade hospitals, because due to the pandemic, the wideness of the corridors is now very threatened, and people could not circulate with patients and all the goods and all the multiple people who circulate, because there are guides, there are doctors, surgeons, and patients, and also visitors who shall help these patients who are in a very bad condition. And also these corridors are overburdened because of the emergency of this, how do you say that, emergent operations and things like that, because things are very dynamically changed now, and one cannot control. Operations are being just rescheduled every hour and canceled, and that is a problem. So that is why I had this proposition just to make all these corridors separated and introducing another layer to a facade, so that we can put out everything, all the garbage, the infectious waste. Even some people could only circulate through the facade because they could just, find the shortcuts throughout the building. And that is something that we can think in a fast manner, So, yeah. And also about these entrances and just coming to a building and exiting, I think it is also something that we can regulate very quickly. And that is something that also Oncology Hospital in Belgrade already did with these many containers outside the building, and just controlling with these guides who are circulating with patients to the place where they have their treatment. And they are taking them in, taking them out all the way around. And also there is another problem, because some patients arrive in good condition and they have COVID after 2 days only in a hospital. And that's how the best surgeons just died a few months ago in Belgrade, the best surgeons in the world that we had. So it is a very complicated situation. I also suggest that we need another building, quickly another building, just to prevent these things and to make to separate infectious people from healthy people in a fast manner, so that they can just, yeah.
Great. Thanks, Katrina. And I think that directly connects to some of the work from KU Leuven, where you guys suggested that, you might want to separate the flow of people, the sick, but it's really hard to do that because people forget where the signs are, the stickers are, right? Do you guys want to comment on that?
Yes, we can. I was also want to pick up on the ventilation issue, as one of the topics we addressed was that making a spatial separation does not necessarily mean that you also make an air separation. And I think raising this, well, it's almost part of this spatial literacy, but then a tiny part of it, making people aware of what that means, air tightness, or even making air separations. We had an example in our study where at a certain ward, they asked for a spatial separation because they didn't want an infection to be spread from one side to the other, but there was only one ventilation system there. And before that could be explained by the people from the technical services to the people on the ward that they really needed to move to two separate wards, it took a while, and it was really at the core of what people were discussing about at that point. So so that's one thing. But then the flow, separating the flows and making sure that both people and stuff don't get messed up. That was what they first did when they put in all these separation strategies, making the vestibules between the ward and the hallways, both at the entrance and at the exit of the ward. But whether you're able to do that in a logical flow also highly depends on how your ward, for example, is designed, and how your hospital has been designed, how wards connect to each other. So this was really ad hoc work, and really was invented in the moment itself. Often, I think when you would design the hospital from scratch again, knowing all these things, many decisions might be taken differently. But then we probably run into something else in a couple of years when we start thinking about new issues that come up. But
absolutely right. I mean, when these hospitals were built 50, 60 years ago, no one anticipated a pandemic, right? And then that's the big question. How do you design for the now, but think about the future and whether it's going to happen, when it's going to happen, and how over-designed do you make it? Because there's a cost issue associated with that, right? Jeremy, Laurel, I mean, you guys are practicing architects or in the trenches every day. Any thoughts on this whole issue of future flexibility?
Yeah, well, I'm really drawn to, and actually I would disagree with you a little bit, because the typology of hospitals from the turn of the 19th, 20th century was in direct relationship to a pandemic, which was tuberculosis. And that the prototype that we've seen in some of the presentations here, in my opinion, actually led to some more interesting architecture as well, because of the transparency and the layering of those buildings, as opposed to hermetically sealed glass boxes. As far as the future is concerned, I actually think that there's a lot of validity to this on-stage, off-stage concept on circulation. That's what we do in ORs, right? And we're actually doing it in our ambulatory, our primary care facilities now, with separating patients from the service and the physicians. And so the idea of a wall, of an exterior wall that's wide enough to have light and things come through, but also circulate through you, there's opportunities in the larger scale buildings to actually separate the circulation. So I think that's something that's interesting and should be investigated.
Great, thanks. And I know we just have 2 minutes left, but I did want to ask Lucy, I really enjoyed your presentation, and a question about the presence of family members in wards. And I don't know how it is in Israel, but here they're very strict about that. But what role do corridors play during a pandemic in the context of the facilities that you've seen? And how can you provide that connection between the patient and the family member, but still reduce crowding and maintain sterility in these public spaces?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I cannot speak for what is happening exactly during the pandemic, but what I've observed in this research still gives some ideas. And this is first of all, I want to say it's a very social and cultural issue. So it will be different from one country to another. And regarding like how, to what extent families are allowed in the hospitals, there is also changing from one hospital to another. So it's not same across all of the hospitals in Israel either. The one that I observed allowed visitors 24 hours because they wanted visitors to be caretaker at the same time, to compensate for the lack of staff and to take some of the load, like the burden that you were mentioning before, of their shoulders. But what's happening is they are occupying the corridors, creating extra crowdedness, disturbing the staff sometimes when they don't want, and interfering with patient privacy when they are talking about another person's file. But at the same time, both patients and the visitors need that connection. And sometimes every visitor type is not the same. So for example, you have a religious family that has 8 to 10 members, and they're all grieving and they need a space. Or you have another family that is in a chaotic situation, calling other members, inviting them. I know that we are running out of time, so I'm not going to extend it more, but basically there are different groups of people that we need to address, respond to their needs.
Great. So that's great. I'm thankful very much to this wonderful panel for putting your presentations together and sharing your expertise. I hope everyone's enjoyed it as I have. And again, thanks to Caitlin and Mohammed for organizing this, and back to you.
Thank you.